The garden. Some call it the outhold, or endless green. Some see it as a harsh, inhospitable land, and some call it the last bastion of freedom. Some strive to conquer it, poor souls. The truth is, nothing out there is like it is on the inside, and it is all immeasurably vast, too vast even. And yet, if you know where to look, you can maybe find it yourself. How am I so sure about this? Simple enough. I've seen it. Household Volume 2 is a setting and campaign expansion for the tabletop RPG Household, published by Two Little Mice. Household was nominated for the ENnie Award in 2023 for Best Production Values, as well as for Product of the Year, and I also reviewed it on this channel. The game uses a fun and unique dice system that the publisher uses in most of their games, but Two Little Mice also published a 5e version of the game called Adventures in the Household, which I also reviewed on this channel. This expansion is keyed to the original rule set, which is this fun system where you're rolling d6 dice pools and trying to get matching sets. You also get to gamble your successes on rerolls. I covered that dice system in my original Household review, so you can check it out if you want. In this video, I'm going to be covering the introductory PDF for Household Volume 2, which continues the meta-narrative of the setting from where it left off and takes you out into the yard areas surrounding the mythical manor that the game originally starts you in. At the time of recording, this expansion is crowdfunding on Kickstarter. I'll leave the links below. All I really have to work with here is the free intro PDF, which you can also download from the Kickstarter page. As always, with these preview type videos, I'll go over the contents, then give you my pros and cons, as well as a wish list of what I hope to see in the final product. So here's a quick history. There was once a house in which lived the master and his family. These were regular-sized humans, but in the house also lived a variety of littlings. These miniature-sized people who originally came in two varieties, boggarts, or human-like littlings, and sprites, or elementals. They lived in harmony, but one day the master and his family disappeared. This led to factionalization amongst the littlings, and a number of battles and wars transpired between them. Then one day, a huge tree outside got struck by lightning and fell into the house's dining room. This particular tree was the Dendronaos, the temple tree, wherein lived the fairy littlings. These little fairy folk ended up moving into the chandelier hanging in the dining room. Then the boggarts and the sprites joined forces to fight these fairies, who themselves were trying to expand to the second floor of the house. But the sprites betrayed the boggarts, and most of them exiled themselves to the outside, while the rest of the boggarts accepted servitude under the fairies. After about 25 years of this, there was a rumble in the basement, and out of the pipeworks came the horde of Sluagh, who took over the basement and then spread to the first floor. There was a huge battle on the stairs between the fairies and the Sluagh defeated the fairies with gunpowder and superior fighting skills. Eventually, the Sluagh spread to the living room, so the desperate fairies approached the boggarts who were exiled outside and asked them for help. Most of these boggarts agreed, and this led to the first all-out house-wide war between all the factions. During this war, the king of the fairies was killed, and they chose a new leader, an empress who was much nicer than the previous leader. She was able to stop the war and unite the littlings, if only to join forces to be able to fight the birds and squirrels that were starting to invade the house, as well as the white dragon. The household war ended when the leader of the Sluagh was killed and replaced. The High Council was then established, composed of representatives from boggarts, fairies, sprites, and Sluagh, but they actually named the former empress as the regent of the house, so she was still sort of in charge, but somewhat beholden to that coalition council. Thus, 97 years after the master and his family disappeared, there was finally a 5-year-long fragile peace in the house. That 5-year period is where Household Volume 1 takes place, across 5 chapters, each one in-game year long. And this is where Household Volume 2 picks the story back up. Whereas Volume 1 is 5 so-called chapters, Volume 2 here spans 2 new chapters. At the start of this new segment of the meta-narrative, Fae from the garden arrive inside the house, and a long-lost fairy casts doubt on the legitimacy of the current Empress Regent. This invasion from the outside fairies is actually alluded to in the epilogue of Volume 1, and it has been 2 years since that invasion. The conceit behind these 2 new chapters is that they tell the history of 2 in-game years, each with 4 seasons. These seasons will each have distinct mechanics that will affect travel, the kinds of enemy creatures you might encounter, and the likelihood of finding food and things like that. In fact, there will be new mechanics for traveling and camping as well, so that does open the game up a bit. As far as the new creatures you'll face, there will be a recluse spider, really deadly mantises, and massive beasts like squirrels, crows, and buzzards. Also toads, ants, worms, and blind moles. I do like the idea of having all these new yard creatures added to the fold. The hope is that they do something interesting with some of the smarter animals like the crow, where you can maybe communicate and ally with them rather than just fight them. So as far as playable characters, here on the outside of the house there are 4 new folk, or really variations of the 4 original littling types, and 4 new corresponding factions for each. There are bar guests, who are boggarts who never returned to the house when invited back in. They tend to all live in a place called Brambletown and have a unique hereditary contract. These contracts, by the way, are an obligation that every littling type has, which binds them to a certain kind of agreement, but in return gives them a little superpower. In the case of the bar guests, they have to honor all promises that they seal with a handshake, but they have the ability to go feral and double in size and turn into a sort of 2-legged mouse monster. Actually, the boggarts inside the house can also double in size, but they don't get all hairy. The bar guests belong to the Bramble Rebels, who do not recognize the authority of the boggart leadership inside the house. Then you have gnomes, who are sprite elementals connected to the earth. Their hereditary contract binds them to honor all barter trades, but they're able to turn their bodies into perfectly still, indestructible statues. They all largely live in the vast area known as the Garden, but when it's winter or when things get rough for any reason, they retreat to the Citadel, a vast underground city connected by a network of concentric tunnels. The Fae are wild fairies who live in and around the stump of that big tree that fell into the house many years ago. Their hereditary contract is that they have to honor any contract that they sign, as well as any signed by their parents if their parents die. But doing so gives them the power of flight. They never migrated into the house like their brethren and elected to stay outside a century ago, and thus they belong to the Seelie Court, a union that is meant to defend the stump of Dendronaus and resist the Empress Regent, who rules over the house inside. And finally, the Japanese-inspired Shinigami Sluaw, who are among the oldest of all the little folk. They have to repay any life debt, which I think means if someone saves one of their lives, they have to repay in kind somehow. This might be a bit ambiguous at the table, but their power is the exact same as that of their indoor cousins, unbleeding, which allows them to heal mortal wounds. They belong to the Shogunate of the Silver Blade, who are actually simpatico with their indoor counterparts of governance, unlike the other littlings. So the core rulebook for Household contains 6 professions, and each of those professions has a number of vocations, with each vocation containing a unique combination of skills and traits. This expansion will present 1 new profession, the Wayfarer, and 3 new vocations for the original professions. Things like the Gatherer for hunters, Inspector for scholars, and the Veteran for both soldiers and duelists. Also, a moth and a frog animal companion because, you're outside now. The Wayfarer profession is for characters who are wanderers at heart. The 3 vocations are Traveling Artist, Valet, which could be like a messenger or envoy, and a Settler. You don't get the mechanics for each of these 3 vocations here in the intro PDF, but just by looking at one from the core rulebook, it's really not about the mechanics. It's more about the theme that each of these vocations invokes. that is important. All right, so I'm a little confused about the nomenclature of the different areas outside the house here. The whole outside is referred to as the outhold, which makes sense since you have the household and now you have the outhold. But then the text says that the whole area outside is also called the garden. Then you have references to a front yard and a backyard. Those aren't actually labeled, but it's intuitive as to which is which. This half of the map is the front yard, which is generally described as wild and lush and generally very dangerous. At the far end is the fence, beyond which most littlings never dare venture. Then there is the backyard, which is this half. It's described as being quieter and more secluded. And then not depicted in the intro PDF is the subsoil, this vast network of underground tunnels and spaces filled with lost cities and forgotten treasures. So alright, here are my thoughts so far on Household Volume 2. It's hard for me to scrounge up any cons because this introduction PDF isn't giving me anything to shoot down, but I do have some things I wish to see in the final full version when it comes out. Story synopsis. I guess I sort of summarized the story thus far in this video, but I did skip a lot of smaller details and virtually all the names of the major NPCs. It's a lot to read across the 3 core books, and it would be nice to have an executive summary included in Volume 2 so you can just get caught up quickly. Intelligent animals. I don't mean talking animals, but like I mentioned, it would be cool to see creatures like the crow get described and statted as more than just a foe to be battled. The setting already includes relatively small creatures in the form of your animal companions, and they're really given more intelligence here than they actually have in real life, so it wouldn't be much of a stretch to make a crow smart. An official explanation of the scale. So the thing I always mention in my videos about Household is the fact that I can't fully grasp the size scale. I've gotten a lot of good explanations from viewers in the comments who say that it's a convention in fiction where the scale sort of changes to fit the situation or something. I don't know. I'd like to hear an official explanation from the creators themselves explaining how littlings are big enough to ride rats, but so small that a stairwell is like a mountain to them. Things that I like. Travel mechanics. I think the game needed this, and although I don't know how compelling these mechanics are going to be in the expansion, I imagine that there's something that can be applied both indoors and outside. By having travel mechanics, you can make the distances inside the house feel a bit more vast and daunting, which is something that the GM would have had to accomplish on their own without any rule support previously. Fun and important meta-narrative. The story of the setting is actually a lot of fun once you get into it, but it's also a critical component of the game itself. All the heavy political drama and the war and enmity between the littlings is the critical ingredient that makes this game so intriguing. It's not just cute little miniature people running around a big house and yard. These miniature folks take themselves completely seriously, and they are constantly at each other's throats. In other words, they're just like us. So that leads to way more interesting stories than just role-playing little smurfs or whatever. It's nice to see that this expansion leans in on one of the main points of the game, which is this ongoing meta-narrative of interfactional warfare and high-stakes political intrigue. Play in the yard. One thing I love about Household is how you can play the game with miniatures in your house without having to craft or construct anything specifically for the terrain. The stuff in your house is the terrain. A bookshelf is a terraced hillside to your little PCs. A cluttered dining room table is a badlands, etc. But with this expansion, you can take your minis outside and run some interesting encounters in the grass or in a garden if you have one. Now, I don't know if anyone's going to actually go through the trouble of doing this, but I like the prospect of it. The whole point of crafting or 3D printing or buying tabletop terrain is to create a sense of immersion. So if you're playing as tiny little people and the adventure is meant to take place in a regular sized backyard, I mean, why not? Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this expansion and if you plan on backing it. And let me know if you've ever played or run Household using everyday objects and environments. I'd love to hear your experiences. Links for everything are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.